Jackson Center.
Well, thank you. Such an honor to be in this great museum, really, of history.
Well, talk about history. Your favorite St. Louis Cardinals created history. Talk about that. Were you on the edge of your seat for...
Well, I was in Philadelphia. I had just done a book talk on that was the sixth game.
Yep.
I had just done a book talk at the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia, and I didn't get out of there until like 9:30, quarter of 10. And my host, who was putting us up for the night, we don't have a television at home, so I don't really watch TV. But I certainly was interested in watching the World Series this year because my Cardinals were in it. So we got to the house. We were staying in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, and we turned on the TV, and it was the sixth or seventh inning. It was actually 7-4. Texas. And then their young player Craig hit a home run, made it 7-5, and then of course it was 7-5 going into the bottom of the ninth, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was a wonderful 2 outs, 2 men on, but 2 outs, 2 strikes on the hitter, Freese, and it looked like it was the Cardinals were done, and he hits a triple off the right field wall, and they tie it up 7-7. Going to the 10th inning, and Hamilton hits a 2-run homer for Texas. We go in the bottom of the 10th. I don't remember exactly how they got their runners on. Oh, let's see. Yeah, they had. I actually don't remember how they got the 2 runs but they had 2 outs, 2 ran on. And you'll have to actually fill in the blanks for me.
2 strikes.
2 strikes, 2 outs, 2 on. They already had scored a run, I believe. Maybe on a pass ball or an error.
Yeah.
And it was a base hit, right?
Yeah.
Made it 7-7, 9-9. Yeah. Then we're going into the 11th inning. And Texas goes out 1-2-3. The bottom of the 11th. Freese is up again, the guy that hit the 2-run triple in the 9th. I think he hit the first pitch, I'm not sure. First or second pitch. What pitch was it?
Fourth or fifth.
Fourth or fifth pitch, whatever. I know it was a low pitch, kind of at the knees. Hits it over the center field fence for a home run.
Amazing game.
11-10. Or was it 10-9? Probably one of the greatest World Series games in history. With those 2 consecutive 2-out, 2-strike pitches that tied up the game twice and then won the game. Yeah, I was thrilled. That was the day that I was at Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! I said, wow, I get on Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! The same day the Cardinals win the World. No, actually, I was on the next day when the Cardinals won the series the next day.
What's your interest in the Cardinals?
Well, and after I was struck down by the train, I had a Cardinal hat on. It was knocked off, of course. And I still have that hat in my own archives. And the Cardinals realized I was a Cardinal fan. They sent me a letter. They sent me a St. Louis Cardinal batting helmet and 2 autographed baseballs. And the note said something like, to a great Cardinal fan, we really appreciate your support over the years. And sorry for what has happened to you, but so that was pretty neat. And I got, Stan Musial sent me a signed copy of his autobiography.
Wow.
And of course, I grew up with Stan Musial's picture over my bed.
Of course.
And in fact, my brother and I got his autograph, Musial's autograph, when he had retired. We were watching a game at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. The Cardinals were playing the Giants, and I said to my brother, we were in box seats on the first base side, just pretty near home plate, but on the first base side. I said, that looks like Stan Musial sitting about 8 rows down in front of us. And Dwight said, no. I said, that's Musial. Of course, he was 3 years in retirement by that time.
Yeah.
And so Dwight took our scorecard. I had a little Instamatic camera. I almost put that picture in the book. He walked down, and sure enough, Muriel signed the scorecard, and we still have it, of course, in our personal family archives.
I mean, I'm still rifling through the pages, as you have met many very interesting people, and throughout it all is the St. Louis Cardinals hat. Now, I'm not going to dwell on it
Well, it's the
forever.
only thing that stayed the same since I was a kid. Everything else is gone.
Well, you must have created an impression. I mean, just even the track pictures and stuff like that. How does Brian Willson go from Geneva, New York, to Asheville, to Chautauqua Lake School, and find yourself in a situation where you're so well known as an activist? What was that tipping point?
Well, there were actually, as I was writing the book, there were a number of experiences I realized was ushering me out of the box, out of the comfortable little box I grew up in. Living in the D.C. jail for 10.5 months while I was in law school, that was an eye-opening experience. I lived with prisoners, I ate with prisoners, I interviewed prisoners for 10 months, 10.5 months.
That was a project you were doing, right?
That was part of my law school internship. I was bored as a law student if I didn't do something more tangible, so I lived in the D.C. jail. I had to sign a waiver of insurance liability for the jail in order to do that. And I went to all the black Muslim meetings for a year, and that was a really eye-opening. They would talk about the class, race-based society, and I thought, I wonder if they're right, you know. I was still very naive.
Was this during the
64, 65, 66.
the Malcolm X time period?
I was reading the Autobiography of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was assassinated in 65. And I was reading Alex Haley's, he co-wrote it with Malcolm X. And I was really fascinated with the Malcolm X story. And I was reading that while I was going to the black Muslim meetings. Still very naive, however. You know. Well, then I get my draft notice. My school deferment fell through a loophole in my case. I was for the war. I was, we grew up in the McCarthy era. I was very much, I knew that communists were everywhere, trying to threaten our lives. That's what, that's what I was told. And so I was told that the Vietnamese were threatening us. And so I didn't have any political or philosophical questions about that at the time. And then after I enlisted in the Air Force as an officer, and the first 2 years at Headquarters Air Force, a plush job. And then I got my assignment to go to what the Air Force was calling their new Ranger School at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. 12 weeks of training, then off to Vietnam with my 40 men. I didn't really want to be in that assignment because there was a term in those days called chicken hawk. It meant you were a hawk on the war, but a chicken, you didn't want to fight in the war. That fit me perfectly. I'd rather stay in graduate school. Comfortable. Who wants to be putting their lives on the line, even though I thought it was a good cause. So while I was in Vietnam in 1969, oh, by the way, of course, I think every soldier, every airman, every Marine, certainly every officer, and I was an officer, had to learn the rules of engagement. The U.S. Army rules of engagement, which applied to everybody in the military. In fact, it applies to everybody in even civilian society, really. It incorporated the Nuremberg principles pretty explicitly. And you certainly wouldn't target civilians or civilian infrastructure. It would be a war crime. And so I had grown up with occasional visits from what I call Uncle Franklin, but he was somehow a distant uncle. I never quite understood how to call him, but he was a relative. And I remember at our dining room table, he would be talking about his days as a young lieutenant in the Army working at Nuremberg. And I didn't know much about Nuremberg, but I remember him talking about being at the Nuremberg tribunals. So that was just a little fleeting memory of him talking about Nuremberg. And then I'm learning the rules of engagement, which, as I said, incorporate the Nuremberg principles into the rules of war. So while I'm in Vietnam, my main job is to protect fighter bombers from being attacked so they can carry out their bombing missions. And my unit had heavy machine guns and mortars and counter radar systems, so we were detecting mortars coming in. We were attacked, the base had been attacked, the most attacked base in Vietnam, so it was, you know, it was like my adrenaline is running all the time. But I was asked to do an extra duty, which was to go and investigate the after effects of bombing missions to make sure the pilots were hitting their targets. And I did not know or think about what a target was. I was just, okay, a target, just. And in 1 week, I went to 5 targets, and they were all inhabited fishing villages. Somewhere between, in that week, I saw somewhere between 700 and 900 murdered Vietnamese civilians, more than half of whom were children. I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. I quickly discovered this was policy. It was intentional. We needed body counts. These villages were bombed at 300 feet. Each pilot could see clearly what they were bombing. Mostly women and children, because the men were outside of the village centers, either working in fields or in the South Vietnamese Army. And I further investigated whether this was policy or not, because I still naively was holding on to the hope that maybe these were mistakes, not intentional. And when I went to our headquarters intelligence office in Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, and I said, I want to look at all these bombing reports. And I found what I thought were the bombing reports of the villages I had witnessed the after. And I was in the villages within an hour after the bombings. Everything was fresh, including the burning flesh, the pungent odor. And the intelligence chief told me that they were trying to figure out why the reports indicated gleefully that they had just destroyed a VC unit here, a VC unit here. And there was a map showing VC units destroyed here and here and here. But then we find that these VC units are discovered in another location a few days later. I said, well, here's the explanation. You're not hitting VC units. You're hitting villages. They're turkey shoots, easy targets. And so you're murdering civilians. And I hadn't even quite understood yet that we were the invading forces in Vietnam, and that if you were VC, you were still legitimately defending your country from an outside force. But I hadn't quite gotten to that point yet. So, but it says clearly these are civilians, and they're not even armed. There's no defenses in these villages. And I said, this is in violation of our rules of engagement. It's grotesquely criminal. And my superiors laughed. And I knew at that point that the rules of war were just rhetorical. They were written down, but once you're in war, it means nothing. So I got really interested over the years in studying whether there was such a thing as rules of war, going back to studying the Nuremberg principles, the war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and I said, you know, we committed the ultimate crime against peace by invading Vietnam, and in order to maintain the war, every day we had to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. We had 44 torture centers in Vietnam. Every province had a torture center. There was one 7 miles from my base. And it just was overwhelming to me. It became absurd. Now, that was the origins of my radicalization, or my deep questioning of assumptions. And then I finished law school in 1972, and I already had a master's degree in criminology, and I discovered when I had my first case, I just couldn't get myself to rise when the bailiff said, "Everybody rise," and I didn't know that was going to happen. But something deeply had occurred in my soul, in my psyche, that obeying authority was not a good idea for me. I didn't trust what happens to me in that process, so I had to leave the law, because it happened 3 times, and I wasn't going to. The 4th time I would be held in contempt and probably go to jail. And it just, I knew it just wasn't going to work for me. And I was actually embarrassed at the time. It wasn't something I was even proud of. It was something I was still working through. So over the years, I have been fascinated with the fact that Robert Jackson came from my home area in Chautauqua County, that he had been such a prominent lawyer, a Democratic lawyer from a Republican area, had been Attorney General. He dissented in the Japanese internment camp case, which was very impressive to me. I started accumulating materials about Nuremberg. I have files and files at home about Nuremberg and Jackson. I knew also that the International Military Tribunal that was signed the agreement was signed at least on August 8th, which, by the way, was 2 days after we bombed Hiroshima and 1 day before we bombed Nagasaki, and I thought that was ironic. It didn't seem to apply to bombing. In fact, it didn't. The tribunal agreed it wouldn't cover bombing crimes. And then I realized, as I studied U.S. history and studied military history extensively after Vietnam, that we have always violated, even since the Nuremberg Principles were adopted, officially, I guess, in 1950 by the United Nations. We pay no attention to them whatsoever. They're for somebody else. So it's victor's justice. And so I always kind of knew that perhaps the flaw was in human consciousness more than in the written law, and that clearly my country, the United States, flaunted it constantly. I mean, we've invaded 350 times since World War II. And none of them have been declared even, the Congress hasn't declared war in any of those situations. That's correct. We have not declared war since World War II. And so I figured all 350 of these military interventions have been violating of Nuremberg. And all the presidents and all the congressional funders and the military leaders would, if they were Germans, would have been subject to prosecution. And so I understood that we live in double standards, kind of a rhetorical jiu-jitsu of making yourself look good, but when you look at the behavior, it's contradicted. It really is a contradiction, and abhorrent. It became abhorrent to me, and it just continued to radicalize me to look at U.S. history, look at world history. And then after I had spent a number of months over a couple of years in Nicaragua and El Salvador studying Reagan's, remember President Reagan, this guy that so many people love, he was describing a Soviet beachhead in Central America, and our sacred banana republics, as people were creating these self-determination movements. He called them Marxist-Leninists. So I knew that was a code word for basically impoverished people organizing their own self-determination and justice processes. And so I was fascinated with going and personally examining all these policies, which I knew were, by that time, were fundamentally just mass murder under the cover of fighting communism. You describe the Soviet beachhead over and over. Soviet beachhead, you know, and figuring that the American people would buy it. Well, a lot of us didn't buy it. And so after witnessing lots of murders and maimings by U.S. money and U.S. weapons in Nicaragua and El Salvador, I decided with some other people that we would go to the source of the weapons, which was Concord, California Naval Weapons Station, the largest Pentagon arsenal on the West Coast, from which the weapons were going to Nicaragua and El Salvador. It was also the source of weapons that went to Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And there had always been a lot of protests at that base. Mm-hmm. And I said, I think the appropriate name for our obstruction activities is the Nuremberg Actions. Mm-hmm. And so we formed Nuremberg Actions on June 10th, 1987. We started an occupation at the tracks, and our job was to obstruct the further participation of illegal activity leading to the illegal and criminal murder of civilians in Central America. And our job was to defy the law, was to disobey the law that says you can't obstruct munitions trains. There's a big sign, year in prison, $5,000 fine. Of course, we knew that we were likely to go to jail, but we said we're Nuremberg Actions, and our obligation as U.S. citizens is to uphold Nuremberg, which we would have said after World War II. We would have hoped the Germans would have applied the Nuremberg principles to themselves. Of course, it was victor's justice. So we that became a name that stuck for about I think that Nuremberg Actions encampment occupation lasted for almost 15 years.
Okay.
And after I was struck by the train on September 1st, 87, in another criminal act where the train accelerated to more than 3 times the speed limit, which was 5 miles an hour, and was accelerating 17 miles an hour, according to the FBI, the train crew had been ordered that day not to stop for us. We found that out, of course, later.
In the case. Yeah.
And why? Because they were fearing that the 3 of us veterans who were on the tracks that day were going to hijack the train, which of course was absurd. The train is only on 3 miles of track. 350 armed Marines protect the train. Speed limit 5 miles an hour. 2 spotters in the front of the locomotive, whose job it is to make sure the tracks are always clear of anything, because the train carries only highly explosive munitions. And then after 18 days in the hospital, recovering from 19 major injuries, well, you know,
do you have much recall of that?
I have no recall of being hit.
Other than looking at some horrific pictures.
Yeah, I have no memory for 4 days.
Yeah.
They call it retrograde amnesia. I have a huge skull fracture.
Yeah.
You know, I have a piece of my skull the size of a lemon that was completely dislodged and driven into my right frontal lobe, destroyed the lobe. That's why people thought I was going to die. Mm-hmm. Of course, I was not privy to any of this for 4 days. And so I woke up on the 4th day, which was Saturday, 4th day after being hit, Saturday, September 5th. 9,000 people showed up at the tracks, ripped up 300 feet of the tracks, and raided.
And it's just so I recall, that portion of the base actually had to go through municipal property, so it was public property.
We were on a public right-of-way. A highway bisected the base.
That's right.
One side of the base was the bunkers, the other side of the base was the port, where the ships took the munitions off the trucks and the train. So we were vigiling on a public right-of-way. And 9,000 people showed up, ripped up 300 feet of the tracks. The police just had to watch. Jesse Jackson was there. Joan Baez was there. Other singers were there. And from that day on for 28 consecutive months, 24 hours a day, day and night, there was a permanent encampment, often of as many as 200 and 300 people at that site. They blocked every train and every truck in that period of time. Of course, they would get through, but not before large numbers of arrests took place. 2,100, I think it was 2,000 or 2,100 arrests in that period of time. 3 people's arms were broken by the police. And this was Nuremberg actions. This was upholding the Nuremberg principles. You cannot move those weapons, those munitions that are going to kill people without moving me first. That was the motto.
Yeah, right.
And people say, did you regret doing it? I said, never regret it. Regret losing my legs, yes, but not regret that I was there. Of course, the base knew we were there. We told them we were there. We gave them written notification for 10 straight days. That was going to start on September 1st. There were people there all summer, but this was an escalation because 3 veterans were going to fast on the tracks on water only for 40 days. We were upping the ante.
Right.
But, being Gandhians, we do nothing clandestinely. So, here, folks, you officials, this is what we're doing. And we're upholding the law.
Right.
And before that time, starting in the early 80s, I became a tax refuser. Yes, very unusual for most of my family and friends. It was totally bizarre. But I said, you know, when I pay money to the federal government, now I know how many murders are being committed on a regular basis in my name, as a U.S. citizen, and I can't contribute money to that. Now, it took me several years to get to the point where I actually could begin my tax refusal. But what I did was I became self-employed. I got rid of my personal property. Couldn't own a house. I paid all my bills for many years with cash, with postal money orders. As I worked under the shelf as a day laborer often. And sent accurate returns to the, actually for several years, I wasn't off the shelf. I had jobs, real public jobs, but I worked as an independent contractor so that the withholding was my responsibility. And so I would file accurate returns. I had a CPA sign off on the accuracy of the returns, and of course I had to sign the return, and where it said tax owed, asterisk, see attached letter. Attached a letter. This went on for several years. I was basically giving them everything they needed to prosecute me, right? I was not hiding anything. They had to come after me. So, in every communication I cited Nuremberg. I said, under Nuremberg, I'm obligated to disobey law. I'm obligated to disobey unlawful orders. It's an unlawful order to ask me to pay money for murder. And it wasn't complicated. Once I resolved all that, it was not complicated. And I had 12 meetings with the IRS over the years, some even at my house, often at their office. And I know they were determined to intimidate me. They wanted me to always sign, payback plans. But I had liens identified, or had been filed in 3 different courts, Springfield, Massachusetts, San Francisco, and I forgot one other place where I had lived. And so I knew I could never, I didn't have any credit, I didn't have any money, but it was okay. And so that was another case where I even cited, I think I cited both Henry David Thoreau and Jackson in my letters to IRS. And so Nuremberg's had a big impact on the development of my activism, knowing that the law is not going to be upheld. But I'm nonetheless spewing to them the law that they claim we live by. And of course I knew that was a joke, but I took it seriously. I still do, even though I don't accept the law as anything that's going to be really protective. But nonetheless, it's a guerrilla game, if you will, of saying, here, this is what you say. Are you going to uphold it or not? And I'm still here. I'm 70. I survived. And by the way, the 16 years went by. The statute of limitations expired. They didn't take me into federal court. 1999, I was free of the IRS. And my income since then has been tax-free. It's Social Security and VA.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, there you go. I bet Jackson never thought the Nuremberg principles would be used as a tax defense. Here you go. You're living
Well,
proof.
I'm sure it wasn't going to be upheld,
Yeah.
but I believe firmly I was on
Well,
strong
statute
legal
of
grounds.
limitations, it's worked.
Yeah.
As you had a chance to really meet some pretty interesting people along the way because of your beliefs, and I'm sure your St. Louis Cardinals hat. I mean, that probably was your biggest introduction. But let's talk about Daniel Ortega. What kind of guy was he?
Well, I thought Daniel Ortega, when during the '80s, when the first 10 years of the Sandinista Revolution, I thought he was incredible. His foreign minister was this Marino priest named Miguel de Scoto, who was educated in the U.S. and was very articulate, very intelligent in terms of diplomacy, and he was Daniel Ortega's really wise guide through this whole decade of dealing with this Yankee from the North. It was funding terrorist activities throughout the country, from sanctuaries in Honduras and blank on the country south of Nicaragua. No, Costa Rica. We had an economic embargo in the country, and we prohibited them from getting any international loans, and so we were trying to starve them. We were trying to kill them with these terrorist activities that were funded 100% by the CIA. And I thought the way he handled himself as the president of a besieged, impoverished, revolutionary country was incredibly creative and diplomatic, and didn't back down. I was with him many times. I spent lots of time with both the president and the foreign minister. Now today he's much compromised in power today, but in those years I thought he was one of the most amazing presidents, dealing with one of the most incredible sieges on a country. I mean, the United States has unlimited resources to destroy them. And in fact, in the end, they forced the Nicaraguans to elect our candidate, which was somebody we funded. We funded the candidate that defeated Ortega in 1990. I was an election observer in Nicaragua at the time. I didn't think Ortega would lose, but the Nicaraguan people had already lost 35,000 of their citizens to the Contras. They had very little food. They had no spare parts for tractors because of the embargo. And President Bush had told them that if they didn't elect our candidate, which was a woman named Violeta Chamorro, a Nicaraguan but totally funded by the U.S., the war would continue, and everybody was desperately tired of the war, which had gone on for 10 years. And so I can't blame them. I just was very disappointed that the U.S. pressure prevailed. But I would always think highly of Ortega in those days. Mm-hmm. Not now so much, but in those days, yes.
Was there a role model in all of this? I mean, when you look back and look at your career, and even as you're pausing to reflect, and I know it had to be difficult to write this book.
Yeah, 8 years it took me.
Yeah, but you sit back and say, all right, was there somebody that sort of was a guiding star, or somebody was there anybody?
Well, I became a very eclectic person after Vietnam. I knew that practically everything I had been taught was probably not true. Mm-hmm. I knew that all these I wanted to know about assumptions. We don't even know some of our assumptions. And so I started questioning everything I was taught. And so I started prolifically reading Gandhi, Tolstoy, King, and then some contemporaries, David Dellinger, who was in the Chicago 8, who was a pacifist. And I was discovering over time that I felt I was a pacifist. I didn't call myself that for many years, but I had concluded by early 90s that I really was a pacifist. I did not believe in hurting anybody, even though I would obstruct activities and be willing to take the blows. So I don't know that there was any one person, but there were a lot of people that influenced me. Validating my questioning process, because, you know, my family didn't validate it, my early friends didn't validate it for the most part. One of the early books I read in the early 70s was E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered. He was a British economist. That book really validated my sense that our technology was already getting out of whack. It was getting too capital intensive. And another book, which hardly anybody knows about, certainly in my friends, was a book by Peter Kropotkin, a Russian anarchist thinker who had been a member of the Tsar's army when he left the Tsar's army to study basically paleontology and fossils in Siberia. Wrote a book in 1902 called Mutual Aid, which had a huge impact on my life about the history of consciousness, basically at this almost at this genetic level, and that everything's connected. And after Vietnam, I looked at some of those bodies in the villages up close, and I had this epiphany that they were my family. I did not know kind of where that had come from. And over many years of studying Kropotkin and Jung's archetypes in psychology, I realized, oh, that was my empathy that was deeply embedded in my cellular memory, but it wasn't in my brain. And so I have studied basically consciousness as almost as something that we all have, but we learn an ideology to adapt to our cultures, which actually preempts the nourishing of that consciousness. This is how I shaped it, how I understood it for myself. And so a lot of people were my mentors.
Are you following what's going on in Haiti these days? And
well, I'm not up on all the details of Haiti. I mean, I've studied the history of Haiti going back to the 1700s. I met Aristide right after he was elected, and in fact, my brother was with me when we met Aristide at the presidential palace in June of 1992, which was 3 months after he'd been inaugurated, or was that 91? 91. He'd been inaugurated in February. He'd been elected the previous fall, inaugurated in February, and we saw him in June, which was about 100 days before he was deposed. And Haiti, of course, at one time was called the Pearl of the West Indies by France and Spain and the U.S. And of course, it's been an island that's totally exploited. All the trees were gone. Nobody had land anymore. The land was all owned by absentee owners who were raising export crops. People were desperately living on making charcoal. And Aristide was the first democratically elected president of Haiti since the original Black Liberation Revolution 1804. And it's Aristide knew he was likely to be deposed. In fact, he asked us when we were in the presidential palace, just don't tell your country we're not the enemy. And of course, yes, we would go back and tell somebody in the United States would not be able to have the president's ear or very many people's ear. And I was in Baghdad examining bombings after the first Gulf massacre. On October 1st, when I first got to Baghdad, there was one English-speaking paper there called the Baghdad Observer, and I read that the first day, October 1st, headline, Aristide deposed. I can't go anywhere without being reminded that the sun never sets on the U.S. empire. And these are the reasons why I'm an activist. I really think of myself as an educator. I'm trying to educate about the nature of U.S. society and its reach which is really necessary to maintain our way of life. It's not fair, it's immoral, it's not legal, but we hardly question it because it's the way we grew up. It's hunky-dory, we thought. And so Haiti is a mess. Of course, it had that terrible earthquake in which over 200,000 people died. 1 million homeless, that's a lot, about 10% of the country. Haiti will not be allowed to have their self-determination. And Haiti, Aristide was allowed back in 1994, but he had to make compromises with the IMF to stay in office. He finished his term. He came back in, when was it, 2002 or 4. We went in, the U.S. through the CIA went in and took him out of his presidential palace in pajamas and flew him to South Africa. Actually, they flew him to another island and he was on his way to South Africa in exile. We will not allow this basically banana republic, which was all of Latin America, we will not allow them their self-determination. Now that's, of course, been broken. It's been, that pattern has been broken lately, but it hasn't been broken in Haiti because we didn't allow their first first democratic elected president, a liberation theology priest. And when we went into the worst slums in the hemisphere in Cité Soleil, in Port-au-Prince, they had signs everywhere in their shacks about Tide, I think they called him Tide, Aristide, Tide, and they were just excited. They were still, this was in June, several months after he'd been inaugurated, people were just so excited that they finally felt they had a president that was not going to maintain a repressive regime over their lives. And they were celebrating. I mean, in the midst of incredible impoverishment. And so that was short-lived. And it still hasn't, it just hasn't been allowed to. And I see, until the U.S. agrees with rules of war, if they ever do, no nation is safe from our reach. If we want something, or if we want to stop at a good example to other people, such as Nicaragua or El Salvador, we will make sure they don't succeed. And that was what Vietnam was really about. Yes, they had precious minerals like tungsten and rubber, but really it was the good example of finally post-World War II revolution of colonial, states that had been colonized. They were now going to be liberated. And a rhetoric from Western powers encouraged this, and going back to Woodrow Wilson and to FDR. They would be liberated after the war. And of course, when they tried to liberate themselves, we realized that was a bad example, because if they succeed, then other poor nations will get the idea that they can have self-determination, which will very, very much interfere with our ability to exploit their resources, as has been the pattern. All European nations have been imperial, so we were just the latest one. So Haiti's a mess, and everybody in Haiti, since Aristide, has been basically corrupt. And even if they don't seem to be completely U.S. puppets, they can't function without complying with the IMF, without basically taking their orders from Washington. And I just find that abhorrent, but I can't stop it. All I can do is talk about it, and I can share my experiences and my journeys. And the only thing that has kept me from suicide over the years, quite frankly, is simply to tell the truth the best I can. Not to pretend, not to gloss things over. Once you see the lie and the lie is exposed, you can't hang on to it, because you have to keep lying to hang on to it, and then you're going against yourself, what you now know deeply, and you're depressed. You have to drink yourself to death, or literally, commit suicide. I was director of a Veterans Outreach Center for 2 years in Massachusetts in the 80s. In that time period, 12 veterans committed suicide. I knew this was a heavy burden, but there was also wisdom in it. You're a witness to living history. You were part of it, and you want to tell the truth about it.
History, you are, and your paths have crossed with Daniel Ellsberg's quite a bit too.
Yes.
What's he like?
Oh, he's pretty incredible. You know, when I was finishing law school in 1970, 71, 72, he released the Pentagon Papers, which were published in the New York Times in June of 71, as I was finishing my that year of law school. And I didn't know Ellsberg at the time, but I knew that there was this junior senator from Alaska named Mike Gravel, who was filibustering on the floor of the Senate reading the Pentagon Papers. He was filibustering the renewal of the draft, and which ultimately led to the Volunteer Army, which I don't support either. But he was actually filibustering by reading the Pentagon Papers, and so I said, "Wow! All of those of us who realized the war was grotesquely illegal and deceitful from its very origins, there's the proof. The secret history of the war, asked to be done by McNamara himself." Ellsberg was one of the young men who was one of the authors of that report, revealed the total lies of the whole thing, the total fraud. 6 million Asians, Laotians, Cambodians, and Vietnamese murdered in 11 years. That averages out to be 2,100 human beings a day. All for a lie, all for deceit. So, I and many others felt validated. Yeah, you know, and I was late to realizing that. 69 when I was in Vietnam, and then I did get to know Ellsberg over the years. Spent lots of time with Dan Ellsberg. He wrote the introduction to my book. I've spent time at his house. He's been at my house. He introduced me at book talks in San Francisco in July. He's now 80. He's still going strong. He's still trying to speak the truth. And he wrote a book called Secrets, which is about his history with the government during the Vietnam War. Yeah, he's you know, he's an incredible historian. He is an incredible historian, and how he analyzes patterns in history, how patterns repeat, and looking at the big picture, and so I've learned a lot from Dan over the years, especially in later years in the 80s. And he came to the tracks a lot when I was there. He wasn't there the day I was hit, but he was here the next day. He was there a lot. He used to block nuclear munitions at Rocky Flats. He was on the tracks. He himself and poets like Ginsberg blocked trains at Rocky Flats carrying plutonium off and on for basically a couple of years. And I have pictures of Ellsberg sitting in front of the train. You know, he's been out there.
As you've learned from Ellsberg and others, what will I learn, and what would you tell people that they will learn from reading this book on your life?
I don't know exactly. You know, it's a journey, a book about life's journey. That everybody's on a journey, and sometimes I call it a metaphorical map for those who might want a frame of reference of one person's life for breaking out of the box, of expanding the envelope of your consciousness, of your awareness. It's just one man's example, expression of how this has worked. I hoped that it would validate other people's journeys to break out of this, what I call the claustrophobic American box of thinking, which is really very limited. I'm sure that I couldn't have broken out of the box without some very extraordinary experiences outside of Chautauqua County. I was very content growing up here, and I feel like I have an obligation to share my sense of history. I mean, there's a lot of history woven in that book, U.S. imperial history, I call it. And some psychology, Milgram experiments on obedience to authority, because I discovered that obedience itself is very dangerous. Automatic obedience to anything is dangerous, certainly to vertical authority, or hierarchical authority. So I hope it's an example of a journey for other people that might learn how to validate their own questioning process and to pursue those questions so as to the next question, because one question will lead to another. It won't necessarily lead to answers, but it will lead to new questions, which is a process of learning truth. And to me, history is... I was bored in history in high school and college, but after Vietnam, I knew I didn't know anything about the most important things in life, which was this history of the human condition, the history of civilizations, the history of imperialism, how I got caught up in it, how I was dehumanized by it, and how I'm now recovering white male from that conditioning. And I suspect that many people could relate to that, to my life, even if they think it's a little out there. But everybody's life is a potentially out there experience, especially if you break out of the box. And when you break out of the box, the journey becomes kind of awesome, because you see things and serendipity happens, synchronicity happens in ways you wouldn't have experienced if it kind of stayed in your little, your conditioned habitual ways. The best thing that happened to me was that I couldn't practice law. I couldn't obey the protocol of the court, because it freed me up to have kind of an independent kind of unfolding life, that I was free to do that. Not that I didn't have anxiety, not that it was clear sailing, but that in fact there was a certain resilience in me that said, well, you got to take another step here somewhere. I mean, I got turned down by 63 colleges and universities for teaching. I thought for sure I could be a good teacher. Only 3 colleges out of 63 even were interested in talking to me on the phone. So I figured, okay, that's not going to be an avenue. And so something continues to open up. And I have no idea how it happens, but I knew that it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been free of a career. You know, the career that I thought I wanted, the career of security. So my security came from telling the truth, which doesn't give you much security in this culture. It's a very inner sense of security. Not without anxiety, excuse me, not without times of wondering, my God, what am I doing, and what's going to happen now? But at 70, you know, I'm still here, and the life has been very interesting, and I wouldn't trade it in. Another theme of the book is dignity trumps longevity. So longevity doesn't mean much without the dignity. And the dignity doesn't need the longevity, because you live dignity each day with your integrity. And illustrated by an interview I had, a discussion I had with a guerrilla in El Salvador in the mountains, which I mentioned in the book. He'd already had a forearm shot off. He was 14. He was with the guerrillas in Chalatenango department up near the Honduran border. I asked him how he kept going. He lost part of his arm, rough life, roaming through the mountains, fighting off the Salvadoran army, which is funded totally by the U.S. government, which was keeping the 14 families in power, meaning everybody was living as a serf. He said, if I were to go back to my family, we had slowly starved to death on our knees. He said, here I have my dignity. Yeah. And he said, therefore it doesn't matter when I die, but when I die I'll have my dignity. And I never forgot that. That's really important. Dignity is integrity. Yeah. And what else is there really?
Yeah. This is spectacular. Thank you for sharing this. And plus, they ought to give you a World Series ring after all. You and Tony La Russa, you know?
Yeah, well, that was I mean, I was just so fortunate. I was able to get to that house before the game was over. And at home in Portland, my wife and I don't watch. We do not have a TV. We're not hooked up to TV. We find TV to be just a waste of time. But I have to admit that when I knew the series was on with the Cardinals.
Yeah, sure.
And this was the 6th game, and I was looking at the time in my book talk, and it was going on. The question period was actually quite rich, and I really didn't want to cut it off. But I finally said, "Well, I'm getting tired. I need to wind this one down." And we had a half an hour to go to my host's house. Meanwhile, I was losing this time. The game was going on, and we got there, and I think it was the 7th inning. It was 7-4 at any rate when we turned on the TV. 7-4. Oh man, it's the 6th game. If Texas wins, they won the series. And then to see the 10-9 victory in the most spectacular way with David Freese, who they got in the trade with the Dodgers when they traded off Edmonds near the end of his career. Freese was the throw-in player. He lives in the St. Louis area. Yeah. He grew up in the St. Louis area, and he turns out he's a really good hitter and a good clutch hitter. So, yes, it was a wonderful way. And it was the next day that I was on Democracy Now! On 1,000 radio stations and Link TV, and that was the day they won the series. 6-2. 6-2. So I thought, wow, what a day. I go to bed with, I could hardly sleep thinking about being on Democracy Now! And the Cardinals won the series. The 11th series, I think they won in their 11th in their team history. Wow, I was just like a little kid, you know. It's like I just couldn't. It was just, you know, yeah, it was like, wow. And so life, you know, as long as I live it each day as it comes, I can handle it. And by the way, one of the lessons I've learned that keeps me going is do not attach to outcomes. Attaching to outcomes is a sure ticket for depression. Because frequently what you want as an outcome isn't going to happen. Certainly not in the way you want it, when you want it. So if you stay in the moment, that's dignity. You actually keep your integrity and you stay grounded. I mean, it's not that I'm able to do it as good as some of the Zen masters, but I do practice that principle. And I don't know if you've read Alan Watts' book, The Wisdom of Insecurity. Alan Watts was a very interesting thinker in the 50s and 60s. He was an Episcopal priest. And this book, Wisdom of Insecurity, which is just one of many of his books, the wisdom of insecurity is there is no security. You live in the moment. And that's the wisdom of insecurity. You come back to being in the moment, and that's your security. I took that to heart.
Wow, this has been great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be interviewed at the Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Robert Jackson, one of the people that actually did have an influence on me, not so much early, but later, as I appreciated the significance of the Nuremberg Principles and the Nuremberg Tribunal, that he was so instrumental. And knowing that the United States doesn't take it seriously has always, of course, it's been important for me to note that and just talk to people about that. And that, but nonetheless, it was an attempt to bring some civility to among nation-state struggles, and that was a very noble effort. No, maybe victor's justice is always victor's justice. I don't know, but it was a noble effort. And even with the International Criminal Court today, the U.S. refuses to sign on to. It's still, at least, it's a conscious effort to prevent war crimes. I mean, we signed the Convention on Torture. It means nothing. It's just, I mean, sooner or later, you know, there is such a thing as the chickens coming home to roost. It's kind of a universal alchemy. What goes around comes around.
Well, this Occupy Wall Street's kind of
the Occupy movement is a potential, I mean, is an actual movement that has the potential of being kind of the kind of a movement that's not stoppable because it's coming out of deep archetypes of wanting basic freedom from repression. And as people feel more repressed and oppressed in this country as they are in Europe, we have the uprisings in Greece and Italy and France and London, Spain, based on austerity. Well, we have the austerity happening here, and of course we spend $14 billion a month on wars in Asia,
Yeah.
and we can't fund libraries and schools. I mean, that's pretty absurd.
Sure is. Sure is.
So I'm hoping that people will come to their senses before we go over the cliff, but extinction itself is a correction.
Now there's a thought.
Wow, that's the.
And if we don't,
I can't stand it anymore.
well, if we don't, if we don't come to our senses, that's a correction.
That's enough.
Well, thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Great.
Would you please sign this scorecard and
Yeah.
send it back? He did.
Yeah, and then he lost.
And I lost it.
Yeah. Not that